Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Money Matters. My name is Dan White. I'm the president and CEO of Daniel A. White and Associates. We are a retirement and financial planning firm headquartered in Glen Mills, Pennsylvania. We have a secondary office in Middletown, Delaware, and we are in the process of opening a third office down in Lewis, Delaware as well. We specialize in working with pre-retirees and people that are retired with safeguarding their retirement assets and providing them with an adequate amount of retirement income. And I'm joined on the show today by Eric Parnell, CFA from Great Value Advisors. Eric is my co-host today. Eric, welcome to the show.
Dan, thanks for having me on today. Look forward to working with you.
Yeah, it's going to be a great show. So, we kind of are in the same field, the financial planning field, I'm assuming, and 2022 was a little bumpy. The bond market crashed, the stock market crashed, and everybody came into 2023 thinking, it's going to be terrible. We're going to have a recession, and everybody was wrong. The market went up about 25%. So that being said, what is your view on the markets as 2024 is getting underway?
That's a great question, and it's a question we get from a lot of our advisors. Great Value Advisor Group, basically our primary service is to provide a variety of back office solutions to registered investment advisors all across the country. So, they may need things like compliance services, technology, back office support, and also asset management services. And that's where I come in my role is providing investment solutions to advisors that want to serve their clients. And, the last 2 years really have been interesting. We had the bear market in 2022, and then we had a really strong rally in the stock market throughout 2023, which defied consensus expectations going into the year. I think about this time last year in January of 2023, the expectation was that we were going to see a recession in the second half of 2023, and that certainly didn't materialize. But one of the things that's interesting about the fact that, even though we had double-digit returns in the S&P 500, the performance across capital markets really wasn't that great in 2023. There was about 7 or 12 stocks in the S&P 500 that drove about 85% of the upside in the index.
Yeah, they call them the Magnificent Seven.
Absolutely, the Magnificent Seven. And some of those names, familiar to most of us, there's really big names in the index. But you get outside of those and, the rest of the market was basically revisiting the lows that they saw in October 2022, a year later in October 2023. So that provides a good foundation for the market as we go into 2024. Inflation has been coming down. Corporate earnings bottomed at the end of 2022 and have been rising. Corporate profit margins have been widening with inflation coming down. The labor market remains tight. And now there's talk about the fact that the Federal Reserve is done raising interest rates and might even cut interest rates in 2024. So it's a pretty constructive backdrop as we go into the coming year.
Yeah, it's kind of scary, though, because, everybody got it wrong last year. And this year, everybody's kind of saying, the Fed's done a great job. They've engineered the soft landing. We're gonna get through this. We're not going to have any recession. And me playing devil's advocate, I'm like, well, they were wrong last year. They're probably going to be wrong again this year. I think when you talk to 100 different people, 50 are bullish, 50 are bearish. The Fed minutes that leaked out and talked about 3 rate cuts, that's kind of a little scary too, because I don't think the Fed really cuts rates unless the economy's in trouble. We're not seeing any signs yet that the economy is in trouble. So what's the one thing you think the market has wrong going into the current year?
Dan, I think you hit it right on the head. And it was one of the things that I was thinking myself is that when we were going into 2023, the consensus view was it's going to be a challenging year for the markets and we're going to go into recession. Going into 2024, the consensus view is that the outlook's pretty strong and it's a good opportunity to be constructive on stocks and that and bonds for that matter. And that does give me pause, because when you have a consensus view that's so strong on one side or another, the market has a good way of humbling the crowd when they get too far to one side. And your point about rate cuts, I think, is particularly important, because the Fed forecasting anywhere between 2 to 3 rate cuts in 2020 and 2024. If you take a look at the futures market, it's pricing as many as 6 to 7 quarter point Fed rate cuts in 2024.
Right.
And to your point exactly, the Federal Reserve has just gotten through this big inflation fight. The last time that we've experienced something like this was back in the 1970s. So, they're going to be reluctant, or they should be reluctant, to cut interest rates, remembering the lessons that they learned from the 1970s when they cut interest rates too soon and it caused inflation to come back higher. It's like quitting a course of antibiotics too soon and causing the infection comes back. So the fact that the market's predicting that many rate cuts, the Fed needs a reason to cut rates. And what are those reasons? Well, an economic slowdown or things not turning out nearly as well as investors might be thinking it's going to be going into 2024.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I agree with you 100%. I mean, I've read a lot about Jerome Powell, and he seems to be a big fan of Paul Volcker. And Volcker, all I've been reading is, think higher for longer. Interest rates are going to be higher for longer than we think, because if you remember, Volcker kept them up, and then he started cutting, and then inflation came roaring back. And Powell doesn't want that to happen. He says, for all last year, he was like, inflation's the number one enemy. We got to lick it. We got to get it under control. So I kind of agree. I don't think he's really going to be that inclined to cut rates if there's any threat that inflation starts ticking back up and so forth. But what is a potential upside surprise that investors may not be anticipating going into 2024?
Yeah, you raised a really good point about Powell being a fan of Volcker. And it's interesting. I had a conversation with, a former Fed official who was in the room in the FOMC. And one of the biggest points he made was just, this isn't the Greenspan Fed anymore. When we say something, we mean what we say. We're not trying to play three-dimensional chess. And I think that's important for investors to keep in the back of their minds, is that when the Federal Reserve says higher for longer, at least for now, that's what their intent is. And that can certainly change. But to your point about the risk of an uptick in inflation, I think that potentially presents a opportunity for investors going into 24, because there's so much of an expectation of inflation continuing to come down. And the primary downside risk, in my view, for the coming year is that we see a renewed rise in inflation, or inflation at least continues to be as stubborn as it is, or it remains stubbornly high. You look at the natural resources sector or the energy sector.
Oil.
These are oil. These are areas of the market that haven't participated in the rally at all since October 30th. So if we do see a renewed rise in inflationary pressures, those are some of the areas of the market that might be worth a closer look.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. I've been reading that, the turmoil in the Mideast, I mean, they're shutting down some shipping lanes, and they're saying there might be some supply chain issues coming forward, in the next couple months. Oil could spike up again. So I tend to agree that inflation, I think they're going to keep a close eye on that. Unemployment's still really low. I mean, as of right now, the economy is not showing any signs of a recession at all. And yet everybody and their mother is still saying, hey, 2024, it's coming. We're going into recession. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point, because you take a look at the labor market, for example. Yeah, I mean, has the unemployment rate ticked up a point or two in recent months? Yeah, but we're still at below 4%, which is the lowest unemployment rate that we've had in the current cycle, going all the way back to the late 1960s. So, I mean, there's certainly there's no shortage of people being able to find the jobs that they want, and if anything, corporations continue to struggle to find qualified employees to fill jobs, and that those types of wage pressures are the things that it keeps the economy rolling along if people still have jobs, and it gives a little bit of leverage to the employees to make sure that they're getting paid what they want to get paid. And those are not the typical things that we see in a looming recessionary environment.
Yeah, it's really kind of a unique situation as we get into, and I think that's why you're getting such divergent opinions on what's really going to happen in 2024. But I'll tell you what, we do have a question from one of our listeners, Thomas Dolman of Philadelphia. He says, with a number of problems in the world today, what are your thoughts about the oil industry as a future investment? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Thomas Dolman from Philadelphia, you're right in the same mindset here with Dan and me in terms of thinking about, where are the opportunities? Because when you take a look at the oil industry, it's had a really rough stretch going all the way back to the mid 2010s. The oil industry did really well during the inflationary period of 2021 and 2022. But outside of that, it's been a really tough stretch for oil investments going back for 7 or 8 years now. As a result, you see valuations in the energy sector that are about as discounted as we've seen in quite a while. And they are, on a relative basis to the rest of the market, oil industry stocks are relatively cheap. And when you think about all of the capacity that's been taken offline in the oil industry in terms of oil production, not to mention some of the instability that exists in the Middle East, and some of the potential supply chain disruptions that could take place, the outlook for the oil industry going out over the next 3 to 5 years is fairly constructive. I mean, it may require some patience because it's a little bit more volatile than other sectors in the market. But you have some really high quality companies in that segment of the market as well that could, present a good risk reward balance for a portfolio.
Well, thanks for that. And if you have a question for Money Matters, here's how you can send in your questions to us.
You can have your questions answered on Money Matters. Please go to our website, money-matterstv.com. On our homepage, click on the banner on the right that says, Send us your questions. While you're on our website, you can find information about our host and guests, as well as show notes and links about this show and past shows. Money Matters is also available as a podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, so you can listen to Money Matters while you're on the go. That website address, again, is money, MONEY, -matters, MATTERS, TV.com.
All right, we are fortunate today. We have a guest. We have Ken Milner, special counsel at Warren, McGraw, and Knowles, joining us today. We're going to talk about several things, but Ken, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, we sent in some questions for us, and I'm not sure exactly what you're going to talk about. So I'm kind of interested to hear this stuff myself. But, you mentioned something called the Corporate Transparency Act. Tell us what that is exactly.
The Corporate Transparency Act is a bipartisan act. Actually, it was passed in 2021, one of the first bipartisan bills to have been passed in quite some time by Congress. It's a federal act, and the purpose of the act was, and still is, to stem the tide of money laundering and financing of terrorist organizations by using small business entities, little mom and pop corporations and limited liability companies. And the Corporate Transparency Act is overseen by the Department of the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, in particular, what they call the finCEN division. finCEN means Financial Criminal Enforcement Network. So you can see this is serious stuff. This isn't just some small little thing. This is really important stuff. What's interesting about it is that it targets, and the people who have to comply are people like you and I, people who might have a small company in terms of the number of employees we have or the number of the amount of revenue that we might take in. This is not for big companies. As a matter of fact, big companies, ones with over $5 million in annual revenue and with over 21 employees, if you have both of those things and you have an office in the United States, you're going to be exempt. But the big thing is that small businesses, virtually all of them, every business entity is going to have to file something in order to be compliant with the law. It's daunting to say the least. 36 million companies are expected to have to file within this coming year through calendar year 2024.
So this sounds like it's a big change that's coming for a lot of companies. Say I'm running a corporation. What do I do to have to comply?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you go to a website. Compliance is done only online, and it's a fairly simple process. You go online, you register the name of the company and the tax ID number and everything else of the company that you have. And then attached to that, you must identify every single person in the company who has what's known as a beneficial interest. So anybody who is a beneficial owner of the company, and that can mean anybody with 25% or more of the stock, or anybody who receives a significant amount of money, or anyone who can control what the company does by being having a majority share of directors' votes or officers' votes, or being the manager of an LLC, will have to be disclosed. We'll have to have all the information about that person disclosed, and we'll have to show a driver's license and prove that they are a United States citizen that has a driver's license or a U.S. passport, and we'll have to go ahead and let the government know exactly where that person lives, so the government can check up and make sure that you're not going to be using the corporation for terrorist purposes or for money laundering.
It's interesting, Ken. Being in the retirement planning business, we have to go through money laundering courses and so forth. And basically, people can't bring in a sack of cash and tell us, they want to invest it. We have to ask where it came from and that kind of thing. But it's kind of similar. The last year you were on the program, you mentioned something called Act 122, which also calls, I guess, for these companies for registration. Is that the same thing?
No, it's not. The Corporate Transparency Act is a federal act. Act 122 is just for Pennsylvania companies. Pennsylvania is the only state of the 50 states that allows companies to register and file a statement every 10 years instead of every year. Virtually every other state says you have to file a document saying you're still alive and this is what you're doing, and you have to do it every single year and pay a small fee, usually, to do that. Pennsylvania has always had what's known as a decennial reporting system, where you're filing that same piece of paper every 10 years. Act 122 has said, you know what? It's not a good idea to do this because too many people, these companies are going out of business. We don't know about it. The names can't be used by anybody else. And so just to try and clean up all of the dead wood that's in the Corporation Bureau, they're now saying file annually. The cost is no more or anything else, but you're going to have to file annually.
For the Corporate Transparency Act that you were talking about, what are the costs for registration associated with that?
Well, that's one of the pieces of good news. There is no cost to register. And as I said, in terms of time, it won't take very long at all to complete the registration process for most of the companies that are doing this. But the cost is zero. You go to the FinCEN website and you say you want to file a BOI, a Beneficial Owner Information Report, and you'll be led to maybe a 5-page, 6-page set of questions. Answer the questions, fill in the blanks, and make sure that you do it right, and attach, as I said, certain things that they're going to want. They're going to want the federal EIN, which is, we all know, is a social security number for entities. You have to know your EIN, and you should be able, for the beneficial owner, each one should be able to attach a picture of that person's driver's license or main page of their passport.
It kind of sounds, Ken, another element of Big Brother is watching you. But who typically, I mean, who has to comply with this regulation? And not only who has to comply, but do they notify you that you have to comply with this?
Well, it's a great question because as I said, there's 36 million companies out there.
Right, right.
And I don't know how they're going to be able to find them all. Some companies were formed back in 1923 or 1940 or whatever. Haven't filed anything. Nobody knows where they are. The people may have died that formed the company. How they're going to notify people, et cetera, is going to be very, very difficult. But the fact of the matter is, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And one of the ways they do it is by having people like me come on to shows like this and tell the public, hey, this means you. Don't think you're too small. Don't think you don't matter. Don't think because the company hasn't done anything in the last couple of years that you're not going to have to file. You will have to file. We'll make it as easy for you as we can, but you will have to file. And the penalties for not filing are stiff. It's kind of like tax returns. Even if you have a zero tax return, you still better file the return because there's a penalty for not filing the return. The same thing is true here. Nothing has to be paid, but if you don't file the return, it is a $500 per day fine for not filing on time with a maximum fine of $10,000. If you knowingly fail to file, you deliberately don't file because you don't want to list the owners, the beneficial owners of your business. And if you don't file, knowingly, you can spend up to 2 years in jail.
So, this sounds like, a really important thing that corporations need to keep their eyes on. And I know, for a lot of people running a corporation, particularly if it's a smaller business, a lot of times they want to do things right. They don't want to do things wrong. And sometimes they make mistakes and aren't even aware of it. So it sounds like having an attorney involved would be a good idea for a lot of corporations. Should people contact an attorney? And if they do, who should they be contacting? What questions should they be asking?
That's a great question. To me, you should have not started your business entity without contacting an attorney and an accountant, someone to make sure that you're filing the right type of business entity, that the forms are filed properly, etc. But once it's done, once you've already formed the company, this is one of the few times where you don't need an attorney to do the filing for the Corporate Transparency Act compliance. You don't need, my clients are not going to use me. I don't think they should use me to do this. My job as the attorney is to notify them that they better do it. I spent the better part of a week or so making a list of all of my active clients that have business entities, making sure that I had their email and home street addresses. And I'm going to be sending out notices within the next, several weeks to every single one of them and saying, you've got to do this, and telling them where they have to go. I'll give them the link to the website, tell them the information they're going to have to go and provide, and then do it. I'll also provide to them the name of some filing services that I think are reputable and who will help them through some of these things. If you're kind of like me and you're a little bit nervous about trying to file things online, or you're worried that you're going to make a mistake, there are filing services that have set up Corporate Transparency Act systems to help people through it.
So Ken, if you said this already, I apologize. But again, you got businesses anywhere from, the guy who runs his own service station to, my firm, we have about 13, 14 employees. Who is required to file? What size of business And if you haven't filed because you just didn't know about this, how long do you have to comply? And do the penalties apply to you? Can you plead ignorance? I didn't know.
Well, as I said, the first question that you had was who has to do it? And as I said, if you formed a business entity and you haven't dissolved that business entity, if that entity was formed, then you have to comply. And it doesn't matter whether you're one person or 18 people. Unless you are big enough, unless you have over $5 million in proven revenue, meaning you can show a tax return with $5 million in revenue for the past year, and you have over 20 employees, and you have a street address, then you're exempt. If you are a charitable organization, a 501c organization that's tax exempt, you are exempt from the CTA filing. But your company and the sole proprietor who has a lemonade stand all have to go ahead and file. If you use the Corporation Bureau of whatever state you're in to file something and to form a company, you've got to file. Now, how much time was your second question? If your company was formed up to December 31, 2023, you will have the full year this year. So December 31, 2024 to make this filing. If you form the company this year, 2024, you have 90 days from the date you're notified that your company is on the active Corporation Bureau list. You have 90 days to file the FinCEN registration. From 2025 on, from January 1, 2025, if you form a business entity, you have 30 days to file with FinCEN. The other thing you should know is that if there's a change, for example, you have 3 members and one of them buys out the other, and now you only have 2 members, you have to file that change within 30 days.
Ken, one of the things you mentioned earlier is there's corporations that are going all the way back to like the 1920s or the 1940s. Yep. Let's just say you had a corporation and, you basically shut it down and it's still on the books, but it's a corporation that ended a few years ago and you're generating 0 revenues. Do you still need to file?
That's a great question. There is an exemption for what they call inactive companies. If the company was formed before 2020, has had no business and when I say no business, it means not $1,000 has transferred or changed hands or been taken in as revenue during that period of time, and there have been no changes in ownership of that company, then that company will fill the exemption.
Well, Ken, it sounds like we've all got some work to do. We better get online and do these registrations. We want to thank you for being on the show today. Our next guest is going to be Kyle and Keith O'Brien, co-owners of New Wave Art. They're going to be the guests on our next program. But this wraps it up for today. So I want to thank everybody for watching again on another episode of Money Matters. And I hope everybody has a great day.